She was told to play something basic. Then her fiery piano performance left everyone speechless. A true story. The ballroom smelled like instant coffee and rented carpets. That specific smell, the one you get in hotel function rooms all across the country, the one that says this space exists for meetings people don't want to be in, hit Nadia the moment she walked through the service entrance. She stopped for half a second, breathed it in, and then kept moving, her bag over one shoulder, her coat still on, her eyes already scanning for the piano. There it was, in the corner, pushed slightly too close to the back wall, facing inward, not the way you'd set up for a performance, but the way you'd place a piece of furniture you needed out of the way. The lid was down. No bench had been set out. Someone had put a printed sign on top of it that said, "Reserved" in thick capital letters, which she removed and folded in half without stopping walking. She set the sign on the nearest table. She did not put it in her pocket. She did not throw it away. She just set it down, face down, and moved on. The coordinator found her before she'd even unzipped her bag. His name badge said Derek, and he had the specific energy of a man who had organized 100 of these events and survived them all by making sure nothing ever went interestingly wrong. He was the type of person who used the word smooth a lot. Everything had to be smooth. The evening had to run smooth. The transitions had to be smooth. He smiled at Nadia with the particular warmth of someone who needs a favor and has not yet said so. "You're our pianist? Great, great. So listen, we've got about 40 guests, corporate crowd, very professional, very relaxed evening. What we need is really just something in the background. Dinner music. Nothing too," he made a shape with his hand that meant classical or complicated or whatever it is you people do when you go too far, too much. You know? Just keep it nice and light. Something people can talk over. He said talk over, the way he said it every time, like it was a compliment, like being background noise was the same as being background music, and being background music was the same as doing the job right. Nadia looked at him. "Of course," she said. She'd been saying that for 17 years. She watched Derek walk away and make a tick on his clipboard. He had the clipboard out already, even though it was an hour before the event started. Some people carry clipboards the way other people carry armor, not because they need it in the moment, but because having it in their hand means they are in charge of the moment. She'd met a lot of clipboard people over the years. They all moved through rooms with the same energy. Fast, forward, already mentally in the next 5 minutes. Nadia moved at a different speed. She sat on the bench, adjusted it 2 inches back, opened the piano lid all the way, propped it with the stick, pressed middle C once, just to hear it, just to know where she was starting from. Then she pressed it again. The action was slightly sluggish, not broken, just tired. The piano had been sitting in this ballroom for however long it took for a piano to start feeling sorry for itself. She played a slow scale, up and down, then a chord. Then she played the opening bars of something she knew so well, it lived in her hands the way her own handwriting does. Immediately, automatically, without thought, she stopped, sat for a moment, looked at the empty room. In 2 hours, this place would be full of people who had already decided what tonight was going to be. A nice dinner, some awards, a chance to talk to colleagues they didn't get to talk to enough, or to avoid the ones they saw too much, background music, dessert, home by 11. She knew what she was supposed to be in that plan. She'd known for years. She played the scale again, slower this time. She started piano at 6, not because her parents pushed her, but because the upright in her aunt's hallway had called to her the way some things call to some children, not gently, not politely, but like a pull from the center of the chest. She'd sat on the bench and pressed a single key, one note, and then she'd looked up at her aunt and said she needed lessons. Her aunt had laughed and said she'd see, but she signed her up the following week. By the time Nadia was 11, she was playing pieces that her teacher admitted she couldn't fully help her with anymore. By 13, she was winning regional competitions. Not because she was technically the strongest in the room, though she was often that too, but because she played with something underneath the notes that the adjudicators didn't always know what to do with. One judge, when she was 12, wrote on her evaluation sheet, Unusual emotional directness for a student this age. Needs to be careful not to overdo it. She didn't know what to do with that feedback. She filed it away. By 15, she had an audition at a music conservatory in the city. The kind of audition you don't get unless someone with serious opinion has told you that you have something real. Her teacher at the time, a small, intense woman named Mrs. Okafor who smelled of rosewater and held very strong opinions about pedal use, had written the recommendation herself and handed it to Nadia's mother outside the school gate one afternoon. She needs to be in a room with people who can keep up with her, she'd said, which was the highest compliment she gave to anyone. Nadia prepared for 4 months. She played the audition pieces until they lived in her hands so completely that she could play them in the dark, at the wrong tempo, with her left hand only, while holding a conversation. She played them forward and backward. She played them the way the composer intended, and then she played them the way she would have written them if she'd been the one writing. She played for 40 minutes. 3 adjudicators sat behind a long table. When she finished, the one in the middle, a man with white hair and reading glasses on a chain around his neck, took off his glasses, set them on the table, and looked at her for a long moment. "Technically," he said, "there's nothing wrong here." She was 15. She didn't know yet that technically there's nothing wrong here was the specific sentence adults used when they were about to bury something. "You have great precision," the woman on the left said. "Very clean, very controlled." She paused in the way people pause when they are deciding how honest to be. Perhaps a little too controlled. "We're looking for something that feels more free." Nadia had pressed every key correctly. She had played every dynamic marking. She had given them everything on the page, and then a little more. She had played the way she felt the music, which was to say, she had played it the way she played it when she was alone at home and nobody was scoring her. But she was too controlled. She didn't get in. She went home on the bus and sat in a window seat and watched the city go past and didn't cry, which cost her something. She got home. She went to the piano. She played for 5 hours. Not their repertoire, hers. The things she played when the house was empty and nobody was grading, and she let herself feel, for exactly those 5 hours, every single thing she'd been told to put away. Then she closed the lid, went to bed, and the next morning began preparing for the next audition. That was how she learned to keep the fire in a box. It stayed there, mostly. She learned to be what rooms wanted her to be. The second audition, different conservatory, smaller program, less prestigious, still good. She got in. She adjusted. She made herself more palatable. She learned that controlled was actually something they wanted, up to a point, and that the trick was to be controlled enough to be reliable, but loose enough to seem inspired, and that the ratio of those two things shifted depending on who was in the room. She went on to study music on a partial scholarship. She graduated. She taught lessons. She played at events. She played at weddings and corporate functions, and once, memorably, at the opening of a car dealership where she'd been placed next to a display model and asked to play something upbeat. She played Debussy, and nobody noticed, which was, she had come to understand, the point. The rooms always wanted the same thing, something nice, something soft, something people could talk over, and she gave them that, every time, because she needed the work, and the work needed her to be invisible, and she had gotten very good at being exactly as invisible as required. She told herself it was fine. Most of the time she meant it. There was a version of this life that was genuinely fine. She played music every day, which was more than most people got to do with the thing they loved, and the teaching was rewarding in its own way, especially the students who had the pull she'd recognized in herself, the ones who were up early and stayed late, and touched the piano like it was a living thing. She had enough. She was okay. She was okay. And then she'd get to a room like this one, and she'd be handed a clipboard person and a set list and told to keep it light. And somewhere deep in the box, the fire would push against the lid. She always kept it shut. She was very practiced at keeping it shut, until tonight. The guests started filing in at 7. They were exactly what Derek had said. Corporate crowd, professional, the kind of people who worked in offices with glass walls and talked about Q4 projections with genuine enthusiasm. They came in pairs mostly, or in small clusters, the men in slightly too tight blazers, and the women in dresses that said, "This is not a big deal for me," even though the event was labeled, on the printed invitations, as an annual awards dinner. There was a welcome table with a person who smiled at everyone and checked names off a list and handed out small printed programs. There was wine. There was quite a lot of wine, actually, the kind that materializes at corporate events, competent, inoffensive, red or white, in glasses that are just large enough. Nadia had the lid of the piano open now. She'd adjusted the bench. She'd played a few quiet scales while the room was still empty, feeling the action of the keys, slightly heavier than she preferred, but workable. The sound was clean. The tuning was off by just enough to notice if you were her, and by not enough to notice if you were anyone else in the room. She began. She played the way Derek had asked. Something light, a Chopin nocturne stripped back to its outline, gentle enough to be furniture. A few standards she knew so well her hands barely needed her brain. She watched the room over the top of the piano. People moving, finding their tables, greeting each other with the specific warmth of colleagues who like each other in the ambient way that you like someone you see every day and would probably not call if they left the company. Nobody looked at her, which was normal. That was always normal. You learned not to expect it. You played and the room moved around you like water around a stone. You were there. They could sense you were there in the vague way you sense the ventilation system or the carpet under your feet, and nobody thought about it at all. The first course came out. White plates, something involving a carefully arranged salad that would be photographed by 2 or 3 people and eaten by everyone. The sound of cutlery. Someone at the table nearest her laughed at something, a loud, practiced laugh, the kind that announces "I am comfortable in rooms like this." Her hands kept moving. A Schubert piece now, something that had always felt to her like watching light move slowly across a wooden floor on a winter afternoon. She glanced down at her hands. She had good hands for piano. She knew that without vanity, it was just a fact, the way it was a fact, that her hearing was better than average in the upper register, or that she could hold a note in her mind for longer than most people she knew. These were the tools she'd been given. She'd spent 17 years building something with them, and most nights what she built was this: gentle, present, ignored. And then she glanced at the folded sign she'd set on the table. Reserved, face down, still there. Nobody had moved it. She looked back at her hands. She didn't notice the phone until she was 20 minutes into the set. It was propped against a water glass at a table about 3 meters away. One of those discreet setups where someone had balanced their phone just so, camera facing out, the little red recording dot going. The person it belonged to was a young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a dress shirt with the first button undone and the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He wasn't watching her. He was deep in conversation with the woman next to him, gesturing with a breadstick as though making a point that required cutlery as a prop. His phone was just running. The way you leave a tap on when you step away from the kitchen, not really expecting anything in particular, just going. She registered it. She kept playing. The mains arrived. The room got louder. The specific, comfortable loudness of people well into their second glass of wine and beginning to relax into the evening. The person-shaped version of yourself that you bring to work events starts to soften at the edges by this point in a dinner. People leaned back in their chairs. Someone's jacket came off and got hung over the back of a chair. A speech was announced at the far end of the room. Someone stood up. The pianist kept her hands on the keys and went softer, barely there, the kind of playing that coexists with a speech the way a shadow coexists with a lamp. Present, but not the point. The speech ended. Applause. The room exhaled back into dinner noise. She sat straight on the bench and let the piece she was playing resolve into silence. Then she sat there for a moment, just a moment, in that moment, which lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which felt to her like something considerably longer. She did not think about Derek. She did not think about the guests, or the set list, or the reserved sign, or the clipboard, or the 17 years of playing for rooms that did not listen. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon when she was 9 years old, playing in her aunt's hallway with no one home, the door to the street slightly open, the sounds of outside coming in over the top of whatever she was playing, and the way the sound had filled the space and she had felt completely and without question, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That feeling had never fully left her. That was the thing about it. All the years of rooms telling her to be smaller, quieter, less, none of it had touched that feeling at the center. It was still there. It was always there. She just kept it under everything else. Her hands shifted. The first note landed differently. It wasn't louder, exactly. It was fuller. The way a room sounds different when someone opens a window you didn't know was closed. Not dramatic, not jarring, just suddenly more of everything. More air, more space, more of whatever had been missing. She was playing Rachmaninoff, not a simplified version. Not the well-known opening that people recognize from films. The full thing, the second concerto, the piano part, alone, without the orchestra it was written to accompany, which meant every note had to carry more weight than it was written for, because there was nothing else filling the space. Just her. Just the piano. Just this room full of people with wine glasses and breadsticks and event lanyards and Q4 projections. She played. The first person to notice was the child. Nobody had mentioned there would be a child at this dinner. But there was one. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, in a dark blue dress, sitting at the table second from the back with her parents, who had spent the entire evening either reading something on her mother's phone or rearranging the sugar packets on the tablecloth into elaborate structures that she then carefully demolished and rebuilt in different configurations. She was the kind of child who was very busy with things adults couldn't see. She looked up about 12 seconds into the piece, when the melody first fully opened out. Her mouth was slightly open. She put down the sugar packet she was holding. She did not pick it up again. Then the man in the blue suit. He was in the middle of a sentence, something about a contract, hand raised in the air to make a point that he clearly felt was a good one, and he just stopped. His hand stayed in the air for a beat. He turned around, slowly, toward the piano. He looked. He did not finish his sentence. His hand came down. The person he'd been talking to also turned. Then the table nearest to her. Then the table behind that. It moved through the room, the way warmth moves toward you from a fireplace when you've been cold long enough. Slow at first, almost imperceptible, and then you realize you've been standing still because you can't bring yourself to move away from it. Not because you decided to stay, just because leaving didn't feel like an option anymore. The cutlery went quiet. Not all at once. This wasn't a film. This wasn't a moment designed for a clean edit, but in small pockets, table by table, forks set down on the rim of plates, glasses held rather than raised, and one by one, the private rooms of conversation that had been running parallel all evening began to fall silent, then empty, until there was only one thing happening in the room. She didn't look up. She never looked up when she played like this. There was nothing to look at out there. There was only the music, the specific geography of what the music needed at each moment, and the problem of being present enough for it, which was harder than it looked. People thought classical piano was about accuracy, about hitting the right key at the right time. It was about that, yes, but underneath it, it was about something else entirely. It was about being awake, completely awake, to the note you just played, and the note you're playing now, and the note that comes next, and the silence between all of them. She was awake. For the first time tonight, maybe for the first time in longer than she wanted to think about, she was completely awake. Rachmaninoff wrote the second concerto while he was coming out of a depression so dark and heavy that his friends weren't certain he would compose again. He had written a symphony when he was 24 that had been performed in front of a large audience. The premiere had not gone well. The audience was polite. Some critics were not polite at all. One review, written by a man whose name nobody remembers now, said the symphony was so tedious and so badly constructed that he couldn't imagine anyone sitting through a second performance. Rachmaninoff read it and went somewhere very dark inside and largely stayed there for 3 years. He wrote almost nothing. His family was worried. His friends were worried. He spent most of his time doing things that were not composing, visiting people, going to places, watching operas and concerts and orchestras perform other people's work, and feeling, somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, the particular misery of a person who has a fire in them that they can't reach. Eventually, a relative persuaded him to see a hypnotherapist, a man named Nikolai Dahl who had an unusual practice for the time. He sat with Rachmaninoff 3 times a week, and what he mostly said, again and again, quietly, in the voice you use when you want something to settle into someone rather than land on them, was, "You will compose again. The concerto will be excellent." Whether Dahl's sessions genuinely helped, or whether Rachmaninoff simply reached a point where the music had been held back long enough that it had no choice but to come out, nobody can say for certain. Probably both. Probably neither fully. Probably the truth is that sometimes what a person needs is not a solution, but simply someone to sit with them long enough that they remember there is something to come back to. He wrote the concerto. He dedicated it to Dahl. And it became one of the most emotionally devastating pieces of piano music ever put on paper. Not because it is technically difficult, though it is, but because it sounds exactly like what it is, something that has been waiting for a very long time to be allowed out. Nadia played the second movement. This is the one people know, even when they don't know they know it. It appears in films about loss and reunion, and the specific kind of love that doesn't resolve cleanly. It's the one that sounds like the end of something, or the beginning of something, or both at once, which is the hardest thing music can do, to hold 2 opposite feelings at exactly the same time and make them both feel true. Her left hand laid down the low notes, slow, certain, the kind of certainty that doesn't come from confidence, but from having been to the bottom of something and finding out it has a bottom, and coming back. Her right hand moved above them, picking up the melody, not decorating it, not performing it, just stating it, clearly, with full weight behind every note. There was no hurry. There was never any hurry in this piece. The whole architecture of it was built on trust, on the understanding that you had enough time, that the next note would come, that the silence between the phrases was not absence but space, and that the space was as important as everything else. The room held its breath, not metaphorically, literally. The quality of the breathing in that ballroom changed in a way you could feel if you were paying attention. The unconscious sighs people release when they're in a crowd. The small adjustments of posture that happen when a body hears something it recognizes even though the mind hasn't caught up yet. That instinctive stillness that comes when you understand, somewhere below thought, that something real is happening. She built, slowly, the way a storm builds when you can see it arriving from a long distance. You watch the color of the sky change. You feel the air pressure shift against your skin. You know what's coming, and you still aren't fully ready for it when it does come, because knowing something is coming and actually experiencing it are never quite the same thing. The first time she played this piece through, as a teenager, alone in the school music room, after everyone had gone home, she'd cried somewhere in the middle of it without quite knowing why. Not from sadness exactly, not from anything she could name, from the feeling that someone else, someone who had been dead for 60 years by then, had felt something this exact, this specific, this private, and had found a way to put it somewhere outside themselves, had taken it out of the place it was stuck and made a home for it in sound. That was what music did, at its best. It took things that had no language and gave them somewhere to live outside the person who was carrying them. She played the passage where the melody breaks open. It is not dramatic in a showy way. There are no theatrical flourishes, no grand gesture. It just arrives. The moment where everything that has been quietly building underneath the surface finally comes through, and it's bigger than you were braced for and quieter than you expected, both things at once, and your chest does something involuntary that you weren't planning on. The woman sitting closest to the piano, somewhere in her 50s, reading glasses pushed up onto her head, name badge from one of the companies sponsoring the evening, had one hand pressed to her mouth. She was not crying. She was simply holding herself still, the way you hold yourself still when something has come unexpectedly close. The child in the dark blue dress had not moved in 4 minutes. The sugar packets were untouched. Derek was standing near the service entrance door. He'd come back into the room to check the timeline for dessert. There was always a specific moment to check the kitchen, and he was precise about his timelines. And he had stopped mid-step when he heard what was coming from the piano corner. He stood there now, clipboard in his hand, not looking at his clipboard. He was a man who prided himself on knowing what kind of evening an event was going to be from the first 10 minutes. He read rooms the way other people read weather. This had been a smooth, predictable evening. Corporate crowd, nice dinner, light background music. He had no category for what was happening right now. He thought, somewhere in the back of his mind, I told her to keep it light. And then he thought nothing at all, because the music had reached the part where it gets very quiet, the part after the build, where you would expect something to release, but instead everything slows down and gets quieter and somehow more concentrated, as though all the feeling that had been spreading out is now being drawn into a single point. And Derek, who had spent his career ensuring that events ran without emotional surprises, found that he genuinely could not think about dessert logistics right now. He could not think about anything except what his hands were doing, which was holding the clipboard without gripping it, which was new. Across the room, the man with the raised hand had put it down long ago. He was leaning forward slightly, both forearms on the table, in the posture of a person who has given up on whatever they were doing before. At the back of the room, someone's +1, a man who had spent most of dinner visibly calculating how long he needed to stay before he could reasonably leave, cycling through his phone every few minutes, had his phone face down on the table. His chin was in his hand. He was watching the piano, not Nadia specifically, just the piano, and the music coming from it, in the way you watch a fire. The young man whose phone was recording had not moved the phone. The little red recording dot kept blinking against the base of the water glass. He had shifted slightly in his chair so he had a clearer line of sight. He was not thinking about the video. He had stopped thinking about the video about 2 minutes ago. She played. She played the way she played alone. The way she played on Tuesday afternoons in an empty house. The way she played when the box was open, and all the things she'd kept in it were briefly, cleanly, allowed to exist without apology. It was all in there, the weight of the years, the set list she'd folded and set down, every room that had handed her a smaller space than the one she'd earned, every version of herself she'd made quieter, to fit the requirements of people who needed the evening to run smooth. But here was the thing about that weight, the thing she had not fully understood until now. It wasn't poison, it was fuel. It was a long, slow pressure, and pressure, given the right instrument, makes sound. The music wasn't about any of that. Not directly. Music didn't work that way. You couldn't put bitterness into a Rachmaninoff concerto and have it come out as bitterness. What came out was whatever the music was already. The concerto was already grief and return, and the specific gravity of things that almost didn't exist. She just opened the door and let it through. That was all. And it was enough to stop a room. She came to the end. The piece doesn't end the way most things end, with a declaration, with a definitive statement, with the kind of final chord that closes a door. It resolves. Like a very long breath released at last. The final notes are almost a question, or almost an answer. You can hear it both ways depending on where you're standing when you listen to it. Not tragic, not triumphant, something more honest than either. Just, this is where I've arrived. This is what remains. Her right hand played the last notes, slower than the marked tempo, slower than most pianists play it. The notes fell one at a time, and between them was silence, real silence, the kind you have to be very still to let exist without filling it, the final chord. She held the keys down after the sound had started fading, because that was how you played it. That was what the music needed. You gave the sustain its full weight before lifting your hands. You didn't rush away from the ending the way you'd rush from a party when you're ready to go home. She let it fade all the way, and then she lifted her hands from the keys, set them in her lap, sat very still. The silence lasted 6 seconds, maybe 7, long enough that, afterward, several people would describe it as longer, as 15 seconds, as half a minute, as forever. Time works differently in a silence that has weight. Those 6 or 7 seconds had a texture. They were not empty. They were the kind of silence a room produces when something has been said to it that it hasn't finished receiving yet. Not the silence of people waiting for permission to react. The silence of people who are already inside something and not yet ready to come back out. Then the applause came. Not the polite kind. Not the 3 claps of acknowledgement that corporate events get when a presentation ends. The kind that comes up before the room has collectively decided to applaud. The kind that starts in the hands before the brain has issued the signal, spontaneous and fast and genuinely loud. The kind that means, yes, that, exactly that. The woman near the front was on her feet. She may not have known she stood up. She was clapping with her hands in front of her face, like she was trying to warm them. The child in the dark blue dress was clapping with both hands over her head. The man who'd had his arm raised was still leaning forward, clapping slowly and steadily, looking at the piano with the expression of someone who has just understood something they'd been trying to figure out for a long time. Derek was clapping from near the service entrance, his clipboard tucked under his arm. Nadia sat at the bench with her hands in her lap. She did not stand. She did not bow. She did not turn to the room and receive the moment. She just sat, very still, and let the room do what the room needed to do with it. This, too, was something she had learned. The music was never about her. Derek came over about 5 minutes later. The room had settled back, not into what it had been before, because rooms don't fully return to their previous state after something like that, but into a version of itself that was quieter and warmer and slightly less defended. People were talking differently. Not about contracts or Q4, about the music, about whether they'd heard this before, and where, and whether they had it on their phone. Dessert had arrived and half of it was sitting untouched on the plates. He stood next to the piano bench with his clipboard still under his arm. That was, he started. He stopped. He had not intended to stop, but he stopped, which was, Nadia thought, more honest than whatever he was going to say. I know, she said, not unkindly, just steady, just, I know. He nodded for a moment, the specific nod of a person who is processing. Can I ask why you... I did say to keep it, you said to keep it light, she said. I did keep it light, for a while. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The guest seemed to enjoy it, she added, which was so understated it walked a very thin line, and she said it so gently that it didn't cross it. Derek looked around the room. The man in the blue suit was at a different table now, talking to someone new, but every few sentences he glanced back in the direction of the piano, the involuntary glance of someone replaying something. The woman with the glasses on her head was on her phone, typing fast. 3 people at the same table were all looking at each other's phones, sharing something between them. Yeah, Derek said finally, they did. He stood there a beat longer, then he made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and wrote something on his clipboard. Nadia didn't try to see what. He walked away. She closed the piano lid. The young man with the phone found her at the service exit at the end of the night. She had her coat back on, bag over one shoulder. The piano lid was down, and the bench was pushed neatly underneath it, and the reserved sign was exactly where she'd left it, face down on the table, untouched. It would probably still be there in the morning, she thought. People walked past things all evening without moving them, and nobody had noticed this one had ever been moved in the first place. Hey, he said. He looked slightly embarrassed in the self-aware way of someone who has done something and is not entirely sure he should have. My phone was going, recording. I wasn't specifically planning to. I just had it running and... He stopped. I wanted to check with you before I did anything with it. Can I send you the file? She looked at him for a moment. You can post it, she said. He blinked. Are you sure? The audio from a phone in a restaurant isn't going to be... Post it, she said. He nodded slowly, still looking like he was processing whether this was really happening. Okay, yeah, I will, thank you. She nodded once, the way she had nodded when Derek handed her the set list, with the same face, the same quiet. The only difference, if you were watching closely, was that she didn't fold anything this time. She walked out. He posted the video at 11:47 that night, with a caption that said, "She was asked to play background music at a corporate dinner. I'm so glad I had my phone recording." By the time he woke up the next morning, it had more views than he'd had on any video he'd ever posted. By noon, it had been shared across 4 different platforms. By the following afternoon, it had 5 times that number of views, and the comment section had taken on a life of its own. People shared it with different captions. Some said things like, "You won't believe what happens next." Some wrote simply, "Watch to the end." Some wrote long paragraphs about what the music had meant to them, stories of their own, of losses and returns, of things they hadn't let themselves feel in years until something cracked them open, of parents and grandparents and memories they'd thought were inaccessible. Some people posted it without writing anything at all, just the video. The comment section was remarkable for what it contained. A lot of astonishment, a lot of people recommending other pieces she should play, as though they were now personally invested in her musical education. A lot of people asking where she taught, and whether she had an album, and whether she did private performances. A fair number of people saying they had never understood classical music before, but were now genuinely reconsidering. One comment said, "I was in that room," and by the next morning had over 1,000 replies. The child in the dark blue dress appeared in the background of the video, captured by the accidental composition of the phone angle. Her reaction, the absolute stillness, the open mouth, the sugar packet forgotten mid-air, was mentioned in the comments more than almost anything else. People said it was the right response. People said she had understood something the adults in the room were too defended to show so clearly. People said she was going to remember this for the rest of her life. A few music academics and critics showed up in the comments and wrote correct, precise things about the Rachmaninoff, and about what they could observe of her technique and interpretive choices from a phone video in a hotel ballroom. Their comments were accurate. They received a fraction of the engagement that the comments saying, "I watched this 4 times and cried each time" received. Which told you something, though exactly what, it was hard to say. Nadia read some of them. Not all. Not even most. She did not reply to any. People asked her later, in interviews that started appearing, in the messages that arrived from people who knew her, in the longer conversations that happened as the video continued to find new audiences, what she had been thinking about in that pause. Those 4 seconds between the end of the safe music and the beginning of the real music. What had pushed her over? She gave different answers at different times, because the truth was slightly different depending on how she looked at it, and because the full truth was the kind of thing that takes a while to find language for. Sometimes she said, "I don't know exactly. I just played what felt true." Sometimes she said, "I'd been playing that piece privately for 20 years. I'd never played it for an audience that was actually listening. I thought, this might be the one chance." Once, in a longer conversation late in the evening with someone who had the patience to wait for the longer answer, she said something closer to what had actually happened inside the 4 seconds. "I think I was just tired," she said. "Not the tired you feel at the end of a long day, the other kind. The tired you feel when you've been carrying something in a way that was always slightly too small for what you were carrying, and you've been managing it, and you've been fine, and then one particular moment you just..." She paused. "You just think, no, not tonight. Tonight I'm going to put it down the right way." She looked at her hands for a moment. "The thing is," she said, "it wasn't about the room. I didn't do it for them. I don't think I was even fully aware of them. Once I started, I think I needed to hear it, the way it's supposed to sound, at full volume, with nothing held back, and there happened to be a room full of people around me when I needed it." The person she was talking to let that sit. "And the phone?" they said. "Did knowing you were being recorded change anything for you?" She thought about it properly before she answered. "I forgot it was there," she said. "Honestly, once I started playing, I forgot about everything except the music. I always do. That's the thing about really playing. There's nothing else. There's only this." 3 weeks after the dinner, a letter arrived at the address of the music school where Nadia taught, forwarded by the administrative office with a sticky note that said, "This came for you," by post, real post. It was handwritten on cardstock with a small printed flower border. The handwriting was large and deliberate, the kind that belongs to someone concentrating very hard on making each letter correct. It was from Priya. She was 9. The letter said, "Dear pianist, I was at the dinner where you played. I don't know the name of the piece you played, but my mum looked it up, and now I have listened to it 14 times. I am learning the piano. My teacher says I rush, and I need to slow down. I have been trying. I don't know why you played that piece at the dinner, but I am glad you did, because it made everyone very quiet, which I think means it was very good. I would like to play like that one day. Please write back if you have time. Below this, in slightly smaller, neater handwriting, someone else had added a postscript. She wrote this entirely herself and made me help her find an address to send it to. I apologize for the intrusion. Her teacher says she has a real gift, but is prone to rushing. She hasn't rushed at all in her practice sessions since the dinner, which her teacher says is the first time this has ever happened. With best wishes from her mother. Nadia read it twice. She set it on the closed lid of the piano. She sat at the bench and played for a while. Nothing specific, nothing written, just movement, hands finding shapes the way your thoughts find shapes, when you need to think something through, but thinking isn't quite the right tool. Then she got a piece of paper and wrote back. She wrote, "Dear Priya, thank you for writing to me. I was very pleased to get your letter. The piece is called Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor by Sergei Rachmaninoff. He wrote it after a period where he couldn't write anything at all, and then he could again. I think that's part of why it sounds the way it does, like something that has been waiting for a while to exist." She stopped, looked at what she'd written, continued. "Your teacher is right that rushing is important to fix. But I want to tell you something else that is also true. The reason pianists rush is usually because they are afraid the music will leave before they have said everything they need to say. They play faster because they don't fully trust that there is enough time. The way to fix the rushing is not to slow down. Exactly. It is to trust that the music will stay. It will always stay. You have more time than you think. Play the note you are on, all the way. Don't reach for the next one before you've finished this one." She thought for another moment, then added, "I heard you were very still when I played. That is the best possible thing you can do with music. Stay still. Let it come to you. That is also what playing it well looks like, from the inside." She signed it with her name, put it in an envelope, addressed it, put a stamp on it and set it by the door to post on her way out. Then she sat back at the piano. She played the piece again. The whole movement, beginning to end, in the empty music school in the late afternoon, with the winter light coming in low through the high windows. Not for the video, not for Derek, not for the 40 guests, not for the internet, just to hear it, just because it was there. She still plays corporate events sometimes. She still plays weddings. She still gets called by coordinators who need a pianist for the evening, who need something nice, something light, something that people can eat their salads to. She still says, "of course," when the set list appears. She still begins the way she's expected to begin. But something changed after that night. Not drastically, not in a way anyone else would necessarily notice. Not in a way she would describe as a transformation, because she is wary of that word, wary of the story where a moment changes everything, because in her experience what moments actually do is clarify something that was already moving. What changed was smaller and more durable than transformation. She stopped managing the fire quite so carefully. She still reads rooms. She still knows when a room is ready and when it isn't, and she still respects that difference. There are rooms where the right thing is the light music, where people genuinely need to talk, where the evening has its own purpose and the piano is there to support it and not compete with it. She plays those rooms well. She has always played those rooms well. That skill has not gone anywhere. But sometimes, somewhere in the middle of a set, between the safe Chopin and the expected standards, there is a pause, 4 seconds maybe 5, and in that pause she reads the room. Some rooms she reads and thinks, "not tonight," and she goes back to the light music and plays it with full attention and goes home and is fine. But some rooms she reads and thinks, "yes, this one. This room is ready for something it doesn't know yet it is ready for." And she shifts her hands, and she plays. And every time, the room changes. Not because she is trying to prove something, not because she is reclaiming anything that was taken from her or showing anyone what they missed. That version of it was real once, early on, when the fire in the box still had sharp edges. She doesn't play from that place anymore. She plays because the music deserves to be heard at full volume, because Rachmaninoff spent 3 years unable to reach what was inside him, and then a man sat with him patiently and said, "You will write again," And eventually he did, and what he wrote has now been alive for over 100 years, and is still changing rooms. Because Mrs. Okafor wrote a recommendation letter and called a 15-year-old by the name of what she could become. Because a 9-year-old in a dark blue dress stopped rearranging sugar packets and opened her mouth and stayed completely still. Because music, at full volume, is one of the few things in the world that can reach into the part of a person they've kept locked and not force it open, but simply stand outside it, quietly, and wait, and the door opens. Every time, eventually, the door opens. She has been doing this for 17 years. She is only just getting started.